Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week I've got a cold or flu or something, so it's going to be a bit of a short video. Possibly a little light on detail and maybe a little bit influenced by Benylin. We're going to be putting together the front axle. In the bag we've got a bunch of smaller bags and the axle housings. Now we're not going to need the rear axle this time, so we can get rid of that. We're also not going to need the chassis this time, so that can go off to one side too. I think what we're going to do is sort out the bits we need for the front axle and separate off the bits for the rear. In this bag then, that has a load more cast metal bits, we're going to need one of the red diff covers, the two steering hubs, and two of the clamps with the M2.5 threads. In the gear bag we want all four of the brass top hats and one each of the gears, so one pinion and one ring gear. The shafts and rods bag has the suspension linkages in, which we won't need just yet, but we will need the axle shafts. They have flats cut in them already, which is nice, and for the front we need the short one. We'll also need the four plastic rod ends and the two bent steering linkages. Now we don't need the solid axle ends as they're for the rear, but we do need the two ends with the universal joints and the four brass balls for the rod ends. The screws bag can just pour into a plastic pot, so they're safe and easy to access. The bag with the bearings is a bit of fun to sort out. Along with the bearings, there's also a lot of very small grub screws that just so happen to be a perfect fit inside the small bearings, and they really don't want to come out on their own. Also, the small bearings fit inside the large bearings and can get themselves a little bit stuck, so they need a bit of help to get them separated. Once they are all separate, we can pop the grub screws into a pot so we don't lose them. And for the front axle we need 4 of the large bearings and we need 6 of the small bearings. The rest go with the rear assembly. The only other bit we need is from a separate bag, the upper link mount. It's plastic, but I'm sure it's going to do the job. It's almost as chunky as a typical 1/10 mount. The axles come partially assembled, which is a nice way to keep the black paint off the mating surfaces, at least as far as possible. There's 4 M2.5 screws that attach the bearing holder for the input shaft. We need to remove all 4 of the screws and separate the parts. Now it might be an idea to keep track of which way round things go, but it's not a huge deal as it really only works properly one way, and it's going to be pretty obvious when it's wrong. The brass gear needs one of the grub screws, and for now we won't bother using any thread lock until we're fairly sure it's all going to work. We want the gear so the grub is clamping down onto the flat near the middle of the short axle shaft. We want the side of the gear with the teeth on the short end of the shaft. For the time being we're not going to nip up the grub screw tight. We need the gear to be able to float so we can set its position later. On each end of the shaft we need to slide on 2 of the small bearings. The innermost ones go up against the brass gear and the outer 2 sit near the ends. The axle housing has nice little pockets for the bearings to go in. Giving it a quick spin, it's running very smoothly. It looks like the axle shaft is perfectly straight and the bearings all line up. Very nice. I was half expecting needing to tweak things a little bit there. Neat. Next we'll pop the universal axles on the end. They both need a grub screw and they just slide onto the ends. For now we won't push them on all the way before nipping up the grubs. We still want the axle shaft to be able to float a good millimetre or so. The input shaft and gear are machined as one brass part. To fit it we need to pop one of the small bearings on either side of the mount and slide in the shaft. Simple as that. Next the other half of the axle housing goes on and the input mount pops on the back. It's got 2 posts that slide into holes on the back of the axle. Now it's only going to fit properly one way, so it's easy to work out. Now would be the time to add some thread lock and set the position of the gear, but as we'll see in a minute or two, it didn't quite go as well as I'd hoped. For now though, everything appears to be spinning nicely, so I added some grease and carried on. On the topic of grease, the kit comes with a couple of packets of some sort of gunge. I've got no idea what it is, but I'd guess at least one of them is grease. But to be safe, I just use some of your typical Castrol stuff. It's fairly light, and as long as we don't use too much of it, it's not really going to drag. To finish up, we just need to fit the diff cover with 4 long screws. Now, because it's painted, the pins on the back are an extremely tight fit. What we want to do is loosely fit the 4 screws and then one at a time in a cross pattern, tighten them up just a turn or so. We want to pull the cover into place so it stays fairly straight so we don't bend or break it. Once it's all together, you should have a rather nice solid axle that spins freely. However, once it was all tight, I found the shaft was so tight it was all but locked up. Now with enough force you could turn it and feel the gear teeth. Basically the mesh between the ring and pinion is far too tight. Now I think the Benylin was kicking in by this point, so I kind of fell into my own little world and tinkered with the axle for an hour or so off camera. I'll go into more detail when we build the rear axle, assuming it's got the same issue. What was happening was, when it was all tightly assembled, the brass gear is being pressed into the axle housing by the pinion gear locking it solid. To fix it, I fired a little bit of material off the housing to give some clearance. Now I'd guess it was less than 0.1 of a millimeter, so not a huge amount. Now it's not a huge problem. My dad also recently built one of these kits and had a similar issue with one of the axles. Now it's a shame because things like this can be a complete roadblock to a beginner builder. Anyway, the steering hubs can go in now that we've got the axle working. The hubs need 2 of the large bearings pressing in, then they just slide over the stub axles. Now it's not a bad idea to loosen the grub screws on the inside of the universals too, so the position can settle so they're not stressed when turning. Slide the hub on and we can drop in one of the brass top hats followed by one of the short M2.5 screws. Lift up the screw and repeat on the other side. Once we know it's all working nicely, it would be a good idea to use some very carefully applied spots of thread lock so the screws don't back out. Now once the hubs are on, hold the steering at full lock and nip up the grub screws. It should position the centre of the universal at the pivot point, or close enough. If it's too far off, the steering will feel very stiff and the universal will get stressed when steering. When it's all together, the hubs should pretty much flap about with no force. Ideally, they will be so free they flap about by themselves. Next we'll fit the upper link mount. Now it's just a case of offering it up to the top of the axle and installing the 4 long screws. All the holes are a little bit tight so they don't pass through cleanly, but it's not really worth drilling them out, so we'll just thread them in with a screwdriver. Initially we want them to be just barely poking out at the bottom of the axle, just so there's half a turn or so of visible thread. Then we offer up the clamps to the bottom and thread them in the rest of the way. The clamps have an M2.5 thread in them, so they'll pull the axle together, really making it nice and solid. That just leaves the steering linkages. Now the long one is of course the drag link that goes between the hubs. We just need to thread a rod end onto each end, and the instructions say that the distance between the outside of the rod end should be 100 millimeters. So we'll set the vernier and adjust until the linkage is a perfect fit. Now we just pop in the brass balls and screw it on. Except the short 2.5mm screws aren't really long enough. Once they go through the brass balls, there's only a turn or so of thread poking out the end. So I separated out the screws from the axle bag, and there's 2 types of self-tappers, the short M2.5 screws and the long ones, nothing in between. The instructions even call for a 6.5mm long screw, which these are, but there's no way that's long enough. If we fit them, they are going to kind of work, but one bump and they're going to rip out ever so easily. Thankfully, M2.5 is a fairly common thread, so I just so happen to have a bag of M2.5 by 20s. They're way too long, so I'm going to have to cut them to length, but they will do the job. Rather annoying, but again not the end of the world. There's one more linkage to make, which is the one that attaches to the steering servo. It's another bent linkage that we need to fit rod ends to. This time though, there's no dimensions in the instructions, but we'll just thread them on halfway so we can adjust them later when we've hung the axle on the chassis. Again, we need to pop in a couple of brass balls and attach it with one of the far too short screws. So there we go then, one front axle. Not the nicest build ever, but it's still a very cheap kit, so unfortunately it's almost expected to come up with a few things that don't quite work as they should. Really though, the flaws are fairly minor, as long as you've got some tools at the ready. And thinking about it, as much as I really like it when kits go together perfectly, like a good old Tamiya, I do enjoy it when things are a bit iffy and you have to employ a bit of problem solving. Anyway, that's it for this week. Don't forget to tune in to the live streams if you're about on the internet. The last one had a few technical difficulties where my ISP provided router decided to disable its Wi-Fi and go into a boot loop, which was fun. I've got a new proper router now, so that shouldn't happen again. We were fixing the Gmade GOM. The VOD of the stream will be available once I've edited it to make it one single video rather than 5 or 6 slightly broken ones. So that really is it for now then. So as always, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a message if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!